Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Where? When you're investigating something, sometimes where you look makes all the difference. And if you're investigating peoples and things and trying to learn more about human life with technology peoples and things are fucking everywhere, aren't they? Humans are all over the planet, right? It's easy to make damn fool generalizations and prognostications about technology and society if you only look at one kind of society, say rich democratic capitalist ones, and pretend that kind of thing stands in for all times and all places. It's easy to pretend that every other society on the planet is necessarily going to, or is even trying to evolve into the one you just happen to be studying. By God, how very convenient for you. And it's easy to miss some things entirely, some really important things, if you only look where it's easiest to look, like the old story of the drunk looking for his keys under the streetlight, because that's where the light is. But good scholarship is not easy, it's hard work. So if we really want to understand human life with technology in a broad fashion, we must be sure to study many parts of the world, both today and deep in time. Now, I think basically everyone I know in technology studies would sign on to what I just said. Amazing, though, how often in this case, knowledge fails to turn into any meaningful action. Amazing. But good scholars have been making these points for a long time. One of the first things that got me thinking about it in a deep way was David Edgerton's great book, The Shock of the Old, and you'll be hearing a lot more about David in the coming months. I very much hope to have him on. Few people have shaped my thinking as greatly as he has. But David is just one of the many people who have made this point, like, I don't know, Clapperton Mavunga or Victor Siao. Or, for example, I've learned so much about this issue from my friend and Virginia Tech colleague Fabian Prieto-Nanez, who is writing, among other things, about satellite television piracy and maintenance in the Caribbean. For that matter, one of my doctoral advisees, Panita Chadikavanij, who is writing her dissertation on how Thailand has used satellites for education policy, at least partly in the name of development. Or my buddy Ella Kuhn, a graduate student at Columbia University who is writing a fascinating dissertation on the international supply chains of the Control Data Corporation. Or how about Veronica, aka Vero Uribe, a grad student at University of California, San Diego's Department of Communication, who's doing extremely cool work on Mexican innovation policy and flexible manufacturing, and oh my God, so much great stuff. Or like Diana Montano, or Sonia Robles, or Lily Irani, or, several former podcast guests, actually. I really mean what I'm about to say. I believe the way empirical technology studies are globalizing is the most exciting thing happening today. Now, I can go on for a long time about the ways I'd like to make this podcast better and the ways I think we've fallen down here and there. Should I do a dark and sultry Peoples and Things Confessions episode for you ASMR nerds out there? Would you like that? Would that do it for you? One of the ways I sometimes feel we failed is that I wish we'd had more non-US focused episodes, but you see, there is also a tension here, because it's not just that I am an Americanist by training. That really is no excuse. None at all. It's also that my next two book projects are focused on US history. First, my history of economic hardship in the United States from the 1970s to the present, called A Good History of Shit Jobs. And second, a history of the Ohio River from prehistory to 1865, to the 1920s when the river's commercial traffic peaked, to how so much of it became Trump country today. Who knows? To be determined. But you see, one of the explicit stated plans of this show, actually, is to bring in guests who connect to my own research interests and work. So there is a tension here. What to do about it? Well, my pitch has been that a group of us get together and make a new podcast on global empirical technology studies And frankly, I don't even have to be on the damn thing as a voice. I get plenty of airtime. A lot of you are saying too much airtime. Shut them up already. Jesus Christ. But really, I would be happy to work in the background on this one and amplify others. Especially, I think it would be cool to have some young folks on the team. I mean, grad students and postdocs tend to actually know what the fuck is going on because they have to pay attention, right? Unlike, I don't know. Maybe I'll just not say anything there and leave it to your imagination. And maybe the podcast would especially focus on all parts of the globe not called Europe and the United States. Or you could bring those in too, but in a much smaller way. I don't know. It could be like NPR's The World. But for empirical technology studies, do you know how unbelievably hot that would be? Just, yowza. Until we create this thing of exquisite beauty and hotness, and even if we did, I'm going to try to continue to bring folks on as I can. Let me know if you suggest anybody. We could use a lot more Asia on here, I think. Now, I am a blessed man, a lucky guy, and one of the ways I won the lottery in life is that I have so many interesting friends who teach me so much. Today's guest is one of those people. Her name is Jennifer Hart, and I had a large windfall profit tumble into my life when she was hired to become the chair of the history department here at Virginia Tech, where she's also a professor. But Jennifer really is great in many ways, including a quite able, compassionate, and creative administrator who has interesting and compelling thoughts about where to take academia today. But she is also the author of 2 fascinating books on the history of technology in Ghana. The first, Ghana on the Go, African Mobility in the Age of Transport, and second, the just-released Making an African City, Technopolitics in the Infrastructure of Everyday Life. I use the latter as an excuse to have her come on and tell us about her work and about, being Jennifer. And we also talked about our shared vision of how to get universities, maybe especially public universities, maybe especially land-grant universities, to focus more on the kinds of everyday problems with technologies that, actually fucking impact ordinary people's lives. What a crazy thought. You're going to see this. I had a lot of fun talking with Jennifer, and I hope you enjoy it too. And that's why I say, it's a kind of prayer, dear listener, an invocation for your joy, the joy of thinking and learning and investigating peoples and things. And as you might know, the prayer goes like this. It goes, hey, get excited! Jennifer, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me.
So Making an African City is a neat book. If you talk to strangers about it, if that's something we even do anymore today, what is this book about and what were you trying to do with it?
Yeah, so if it's not an academic, right, or a person who doesn't necessarily work in the field, I generally say it's a history of urban development and regulation in Ghana's capital city. Mm-hmm. In the colonial period. And sometimes if there are people who are urbanists or are interested in kind of urban development, I might talk to them about how it's a history of how the models and theories that we take for granted today that shape the way that cities are formed and the way that they're governed, how that all kind of happened, right? And what its roots are in the colonial period in places like Accra that, they might not think of as being relevant to contemporary urban planning practice or engineering, but in fact is pretty central actually in the foundations and stays with us to this day.
Yeah, and so I wanted to go into the background a bit here and talk about. So you had an earlier book, Ghana on the Go, and I feel like this kind of builds out of that book in obvious ways. So can you also tell us a bit about that and how how you trained into this stuff, and tell us a bit about how you got here?
Yeah. I mean, long journey, of course. Like none of us ever intend to do the thing or most of us don't intend to do the thing we end up doing. I definitely was not a historian of technology when I started doing any of this work, and was interested in kind of the public culture of religion in Ghana that I'd experienced as a student. And I was particularly interested in the way that people inscribed or articulated their approach to religion on shop signs and buses, these buses called trotros in Ghana, and taxis as well. And they're like jitneys, paratransit that's community-based, grassroots. And so I started like talking to those people in order to learn more about the public culture of religion side, and ended up not getting a lot of information about that, and not being able to track it historically very well, but was able to get a sense of some really interesting stories from drivers who were very open to talking to me and had fascinating lives. And in the intro to Ghana on the Go, I talk about this one particular man who I interviewed in that very first like pre-dissertation period of research. And he'd had this life that just connected to so many important parts of Ghanaian history. And it was his role as a driver that connected him to all of those things. And that seemed really important and significant, because in that moment in the early 2000s, drivers were just pretty roundly disrespected by the public and by politicians, and the trotro system and the taxi drivers. They were just constant. There's this constant kind of derogatory discourse about them. And when I talked to these older drivers, it was clear that wasn't always the case, but it seemed like that was not part of the like contemporary conversation. And so there was something that had happened over that time, and there was a nostalgia attached to older drivers and older vehicles that was really romanticized in a lot of ways. And so through a bunch of interactions, I started getting really interested in this. So Ghana on the Go is a history of motor transportation in Ghana broadly over the course of the 20th century, from the earliest motor vehicles through the present, or what was then the present, 2016. And the book really tries to think about and counter kind of common narratives about automobility that are very dominated by Western conceptions of what automobility means and how it's significant in the role of motor vehicles in the kind of creation of culture and society. And instead argues, along with a bunch of other people who were writing at the time, who were African scholars of technology, that technology has no inherent meaning. It takes on meaning through use. This assumption that technology's meaning is inherent and it carries with it around the world. So it's this imperialistic kind of extension, right?
Yeah.
That's not actually true.
Right.
It turns out. There's some things by nature of the very physicality of the object and what it can do that does like provide a connection between experiences around the world to some degree, right?
Yeah.
But there's limits. And so looking at the way that African entrepreneurs, in particular in Ghana, in the colonial Ghana, the Gold Coast, embraced this technology and used it to pursue their own ends, to make to kind of ensure economic autonomy, to make claims on the government, the state, as citizens to some degree, based on their economic contributions, to insist on control over the flow and production of goods and the ability of people to move. It was really significant and challenged a lot of conceived narratives about how all of this works, and particularly in an African context, like this assumption that Africans just adopt or appropriate technology, rather than there being a deep-seated kind of technological knowledge, kind of along the lines of what somebody like Clapperton Mavunga talks about, where there is indigenous knowledge and indigenous, technological skill and perspective that shapes the way that new technology is received, right? And so trying to trace all of that and think about what it means and why it's different was really important. And the outcome of that was me thinking about, on the other side of that, I was really interested in this question of like, why then today are drivers who 50 years ago were seen as, or 60, 70 years ago at this point, were seen as very respectable, right?
Yeah.
And cool and,
Right.
like highly respected, how they're suddenly now labeled as kind of criminals and
Pirates
cheats
and
and
such.
pirates.
Yeah.
Yeah. And really, and cast as informal.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it got me to think it. I began to think about the question of this binary of formal and informal, which I increasingly became critical of. I think all binaries are, inherently reductionist. They reduce everything down to two, right?
Yeah.
And the reality is always more complex. And we use binaries for analytical purposes, right? They help illuminate or contrast or highlight something in contrast that we might not see otherwise, which is what the term informal economy was originally intended to do, right? It was trying to capture something that wasn't being captured otherwise, by Keith Hart, who actually worked in Accra in Ghana in the 1970s. I was really interested in how that term had been kind of used and misused and misappropriated, and how it seems like now it's no longer actually helpful in capturing what's happening, and ends up being a default way that we describe people who are poor in the global South.
Yeah. Well, it becomes pejorative too in your system, right?
Yeah, and it's being used as a lever or a way to kind of enact violence in various ways on poor people.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of hypocrisies in the way that informality is defined versus how it's mobilized, right?
Yeah.
So there's I've written in other places about how there's wealthy people who have engaged in activity that by definition would be classified as informal, right? But they end up getting appropriate. They end up getting support by the state, and
it's called innovation or something, right?
Exactly. Yes, or entrepreneurialism, right?
Exactly.
Like when rich people do it, it's entrepreneurialism and innovation. And even if they're originally, seen as doing bad things, right? Because they have power and because they have wealth and because the thing that they're doing looks like, Western development, quote unquote, then it's seen as a good thing. Whereas when poor people do it out of a lack of other options, or because they are creative and innovative people themselves, right, and entrepreneurial, it's often seen as a criminal act or something that's an aberration or an exception or something else very negative, right? And as a result, they're punished by the state. Their things are destroyed. They're regulated out of existence. They're bulldozed. They're certainly castigated in public, in the public sphere, and so that kind of tension was really interesting to me, and I was very interested in thinking about where that comes from. And in the process of researching Ghana on the Go, I'd come across this series of debates in the Accra Town Council, which was a very, very early form of proto-self-government in Ghana, that began in the 1890s. And in the 1930s and 1940s, the members of the Accra Town Council started having lots of spirited conversations, let's say, about what they called pirate passenger lorries, which were vehicles that were moving up and down this main road. So lorries, they were wooden-sided trucks that were the chassis and the engine were imported from abroad and assembled on the coast, and then this wooden body was assembled on locally by carpenters and painted, and they were used to transport goods from rural production areas to markets in the city. And so there were these mammy trucks, as they were often called, or lorries that were bringing often cocoa from cocoa growing regions in the eastern region and of Ghana into the city, and they were stopping at the first market on the eastern side of the city, the first major market in Labadi, which happened to also be a home for drivers. It was where the earliest drivers come from in Ghana, and then they would continue into the central market in Accra, but they would only have a partial load. And they're good entrepreneurs who want to maximize the profit they can make, right? And so they see these market women on the side of the road who are waiting for a bus or waiting for a taxi with all of their goods that are not really going to fit easily in a bus. And they start picking them up on the roadside. And the market women kind of see this as a real opportunity, a real asset, right? Because the buses are insufficient for their needs. They're not picking them up close to their house. They're not, they don't have space for them to carry their goods back and forth because they're really like passenger buses, right? Like British passenger buses, quite small. And so, they become really popular to the extent that the Accra Town Council starts to become concerned that they're cutting into the profits of the municipal bus system.
Right.
And so they're trying to figure out how to stop this behavior and try to kind of introduce all sorts of regulations to schedule the roads to, which in a British context and maybe an urban planning context more broadly, just refers to saying certain vehicles can't travel on certain kinds of roads during certain times of day. They created regulations where these trucks or lorries weren't allowed to stop on the roadside. They tried to classify them solely as commercial transport rather than passenger transport, and wanted to create these binaries that would allow separation, all kinds of things to try to prevent it. And it never stopped, right? It just kept going because it met a need. And they called it pirate, right? I was fascinated by the use of the word pirate because it suggests, that's a pretty extreme way to describe something, right? We don't often use that word. And, piracy beyond the kind of, Pirates of the Caribbean, like peg legs and parrots, right? really is about something that, a practice that undermines the authority of the state, right? So, that's what those pirates in the Caribbean were doing, right? They were undermining the authority of the British state. People who engage in music piracy, for example, are doing a similar thing, right? So they're evoking this notion of piracy to describe these practices, and it just highlighted how fragile the state was. And suggested there's some more questions that we needed to ask about what was happening and how the colonial state was using regulation and thinking about its power and its exercise of power in the city and the way that they thought that was connected to the control of the movement of people and the organization of space and the practice of city life. And so that chapter or that article, it became an article, had it on a Post-it note while I was writing my dissertation, write about pirate passenger lorries. And so I went back and wrote an article about it, and it became a chapter in this book, and in many ways was the foundation for what happened in Making an African City.
Yeah, and so you also wrote this wonderful essay that we'll link to called "Flexibility, Generosity, and Community in the Times of COVID." So, and part of the point of that essay is that you had envisioned a different book. Just I think most famously, many students envision different dissertations and then kind of had to improvise. So, talk a bit about that, the process you went through and, how things might have looked different, but also kind of how it led you to think about, these things about flexibility and generosity and such.
Yeah. I think, as you know, generosity is really important to me just in life and as a scholar and as an academic. But I think in the context of COVID, so I'm a big advocate. I approach my work in terms of what I call rigorous interdisciplinarity. And ethnography is a very important part of the way that I do my work and that I understand how to write history, that especially when you're working on or talking about topics that are related to people who don't appear in the archives. Yes, you can read the archives against the grain, but your ability to do that has to be informed by some sense of kind of the lived reality of people.
Right. And you're an Africanist, and African studies has been saying that for a long time, right? That you need to turn to oral history and other kinds of modes of research if we're going to write about the history of this place.
Yeah, in a way that most historians tend to ignore or maybe just don't know about, right?
Or resist actively.
Yes, absolutely. But African historians created methodologies around oral history and advocated really strongly at the very beginning in the 1950s and 60s for the 60s in particular for the inclusion of oral histories as legitimate sources. And a lot of other historians resisted. And some of the narratives of historians in other fields ignore or erase that work, but it's been very foundational to African history for a long time because we couldn't tell the history of the continent from the perspective of Africans using only colonial archives.
Yeah.
Wasn't possible, right? And there was so much that you were going to miss out on. So oral histories are very important, but I think for me also there's something about ethnography and the ability to have some degree of kind of sensory experience, sensory imagination about what the past was like that's really important, that I think ethnography gets you closer to, right? It's not the same. It's not like an ethnographic present and things were always the way they are now, but the sitting in a lorry park and smelling petrol and sitting in one of the old, like I rode in old mammy trucks, and I walked around the streets of Old Accra. I went into the homes of people, and went into shops and businesses and other things, like having a sense of that in like a literal sense, right? I think is really important to being able to interpret things that are happening in the past, right? And so in a dream world, I also am very committed to not reinforcing some false binary or false kind of periodizations that have occurred in the history of Ghana, where there's like colonial history, pre-colonial and colonial history, and then it kind of stops with the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, and really around in the 1960s, and then there's nothing really until quite recently. So the 70s and 80s are this kind of black hole in terms of the scholarship. Yeah. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. There were a number of military dictatorships, and the archives are quite slim. But I've been really dedicated, and it's something I did in Ghana on the go, to try to think through that period with people, with Ghanaians. So I wanted to do a similar thing with this book. I intended to go do all kinds of field work and all kinds of ethnographic work and do lots of oral interviews. And I had my own health challenges, but also COVID made it really hard to go. I mean, it was just going to be impossible. I didn't know when I was going to be able to go there. And people were also dying, honestly, like just of age, not of COVID. And it was increasingly difficult to find folks. And so, I shifted, right? And I thought about what I did have. It's one of the best pieces of advice my advisor ever gave me, I think. Think about what you do have and think about what argument you can make based on what you do have. Your argument should always come from the evidence, right? Not the other way around. But it was... It's just, I ended up writing a book based almost entirely on archives, and that was something I never thought I would do. And it hurts in a way.
And it's a focus on this earlier colonial period.
It is, it doesn't go through the whole 20th century. There's things about it that hurt, right? For me. But I think it was ultimately a good thing, right? And I saw the benefit of focusing on this earlier moment and thinking about what it tells us, and really trying to drill into this kind of conceptual issue and making a bigger claim beyond Accra. And so I think it was good in the end, and I'm glad that it worked out that way. But it just wasn't what I imagined. It's not the way I generally think about how I do my work. But it's a good lesson.
I feel you. So I wanted to deal with a couple more conceptual issues before we kind of jump into the story a little bit and give people a sense of things. So all right. I'm kind of famous for having lots of soapboxes, and one of my soapboxes recently has been about the concept of technocracy, okay? So my feeling is that, this is kind of, in the U.S. context, there's two things going on. In the U.S. context, I really think this often comes out of, new left, anti-Vietnam politics. There's, the young hippie, those types are... centering around the idea in the late 60s, and then lo and behold, it ends up in these boomer-written STS works like Langdon Winter, and a lot of STS stuff is very focused on the threat of technocracy, right? And I mean, I think that I'm just kind of when it comes to the interpretation of U.S. history, I'm just not buying it. I think they way overplay it as a factor. And then there's the kind of then there's not just boomer, but anarchist boomers like James Scott, who have these kind of very flat accounts and seeing a state. And, I think I like Timothy Mitchell's work a lot better, but I still think some of that's in there. And for them, it's become, I think when it comes globally, global studies, it's become such a filter or meat grinder you can put any nation into. and I won't single out folks here, but I think that there's been a lot of kind of flattening accounts that are just like, I'll put that nation through the meat grinder now, you know? However, I did not feel that way while reading your book, I'm glad to say.
I warned you. That
but I did want to ask you kind of like how, I mean, I think it already kind of came out in your story of like, you're looking at transport, like looking at the transport story and seeing the state trying to like impose formal rules around stuff and seeing like the friction there. Is that how you got into it? I just kind of wondered how you got onto the concept and why you found it useful, and that's the question, really.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's I do think it came from the like looking at the experiences of people who were just trying to do stuff, right? Yeah. And I think, I mean, Accra is a really interesting case, and I think one of the arguments I make in the book is that it is a really great place to look at how these things emerge historically, because it had a culture of urbanism before it was a British colonial capital, before the British were even there. It has a long tradition of urbanism that is rooted in indigenous cultural practices and values and frameworks. And so a lot of the stuff that ended up being criminalized or marginalized or criticized by British colonial officials and regulated out of attempted to be regulated out of existence weren't labeled as nuisance or what we now call informal at the time, like when they were, before the British were there, right? They were just the way things were done.
Yeah, right.
And what you see, like I think especially clearly in a colonial or imperial context is that there were people who became empowered, particularly by the British colonial state. So Joseph Chamberlain pulls in technological experts and people who ultimately would be considered technocrats in increasing numbers in the late 19th and early 20th century, and other people after him, and empower them. And there is this like overdetermined universalism about the way they think about how technology works, and technological expertise as being superior, and technological expertise being defined only through Western understandings of technology, and that being implemented and imposed on other people and other practices in ways that are truly discriminatory and often violent, and really problematic, right? And erase or attempt to erase and marginalize and police and regulate the practices of people who are living in the city the same way they've always lived in it. But also, prevent those supposed experts or government officials from embracing any kinds of alternative possibilities, right? So they can't see the value of anything that Africans might be doing because, especially by the late 19th century, they're so convinced of their own superior expertise and the superiority of a particular kind of technological knowledge that is imbued in and inscribed in the bureaucracy of the state. And it becomes overwhelming. And, I think probably that's something that happens. I mean, it is something that happens elsewhere. I would argue that I probably would argue that it really like comes into its own in colonial contexts. I think actually the narrative of like the history of technocracy is maybe backwards, and that might be why you feel like this, you're not convinced by some of the narratives, right? Because I think people are sometimes arguing that it has roots in the West or was like furthest developed in the West, when I don't actually think that was the case, right? I actually think it was developed in the colonies by Westerners, right? By imperial agents, by colonial agents, but really like consolidated and crystallized in the colonies, and those fields became professionalized through the work in the colonies, and then get redistributed back out, right? And become neutralized and naturalized into professional societies and models and theories and whatever. And the colonial history of them are erased. But it's the same. The people who are the founders of all of those technocratic fields were often people who were colonial agents, right? And they did their earliest work in the colonies and were empowered and paid by colonial governments to implement these visions and provide expertise that becomes the foundation of colonial governance. So I think it's kind of hard when you look at the archives and you see in this colonial context, like how explicitly it's happening. It's just everywhere, and you can't deny it.
Right.
There's just there's no getting around it. I think it's really hard to justify any other narrative to me, and in this kind of development sphere.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and we'll return to this at the end when we talk a bit about kind of some of your practical projects you're a part of these days. But the flip side then is kind of like bottom up problem solving or something like that, and what comes out of that. So I mean, again, I feel like this kind of came first out of Ghana on the Go and is now part of your picture here, right? Do I have that right? That you're like kind of interested in how the locals are shooting up all kinds of solutions that, if we had other eyeballs on, we could call entrepreneurial or innovative or whatever we want, right? And yet, like, the system can't recognize them.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And that's part of the great thing about doing historical work that continues into the present, is that and doing ethnographic work, right? I was speaking to contemporary drivers who were talking to me about things that were being implemented in that moment, that were a continuation of these earlier practices, right? And they were talking to me about the problems, and they were saying, we have ideas.
Yeah.
Right. We understand the problems better than they do because they don't even use these pieces of infrastructure. Sure. And we know how to fix it. We just don't have the ability. And because we don't have the resources and we don't have the power. And so there's these people who don't know what they're talking about and don't have experience with this, who are telling us what to do and wasting a lot of money on something that's not going to work. Yeah. And like I knew historically wasn't going to work because it hadn't worked 3 times before.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And
only now it's NGOs and like global.
Now it's the World Bank.
Yeah, now it's the World Bank.
And the kind of global industry around bus rapid transit, which is baffling to me, but is like it's like so dominant right now.
Yeah.
And all the consultants that do that work, right? And so that was what was happening. They were trying to implement a bus rapid transit system, and they had tried 3 times before, right? Or twice before, and it was never going to work for the same reasons it didn't work the last time. And people, these same people, technocrats, consultants, whatever, were trained using the same methods and the same theories and had the same assumptions that people 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago had. We're continuing to assume that technology was the answer, assume that something that looked more Western was going to fix stuff, assuming that the problem was African practices, when in reality, the African practices were the things that were working, and the imported stuff didn't work, right? Because the African practices were things like this trotro system, which is like a public transit system in Ghana, that is a grassroots entrepreneurial system, emerged from the people. It emerged in response to needs of the people. Yeah. And so, of course, it is more effective at catering to the needs of the people.
Right.
There's problems with it. Everybody acknowledges it. Yeah. But it's because of a lack of investment, right? And a kind of
you can imagine development policies like built around fostering this.
Yeah, and that's in fact what we're trying to do, right? So I started before COVID and had this dream of doing a study abroad class where we were going to start doing this, creating a development proposal with drivers and passengers that would show what the outcome of investment in the trotro system, strategic investment in the trotro system, would look like and how it would improve the system, rather than throwing millions and millions and millions of dollars down the drain in a bus rapid transit system that's now sitting unused in a lot. So like I had a dream about that. I still hope to be able to do that. But in Detroit, we're trying to do a similar sort of thing. So taking the same model.
So this is so just to be clear for listeners, this is one of the practical projects here about like learning, different communities learning from each other. So
exactly. Yeah. No. So in these practical projects, we're trying to think about how, we can learn from the lessons of the past. We can understand how technocratic systems sometimes fail to actually benefit the people who live in those communities and don't really listen in many cases because there's this over-determined kind of weight placed on models and theories that have problematic roots.
Right.
And so instead say, like, what would it look like if we reframed what expertise meant and what technocratic expertise in particular meant, and instead said, yeah, actually community members are experts in what they need most. And so what if we started with them and looked at what they were already doing to account for gaps in service provision and infrastructure, and then said, okay, so there's models of grassroots systems that exist elsewhere. How might we use that to inspire the creation of a paratransit system or a jitney system that would be supported by the state, and technocratic experts would come in only to help people implement the desires and plans and whatever that their community wanted. So expertise is only to is what it is, right? If a technocrat is an expert in figuring out how to transform technical systems into, like, connect technical systems and policy, right? And that's something that community members don't know how to do. Right. So, providing consultation on, like, safety and policy development, right, is what the lane should be. And then having, anthropologists and historians and social workers and community, people who are doing community engagement help facilitate conversations with grassroots communities about what they actually want and what they actually need and what would be useful. So it's a real reframing of things. We've done similar things with trying to intervene in and imagine alternative versions of training for urban planners, for example. So, like, what would it mean to train urban planners differently? What would it mean to train engineers differently? And we've done that with some workshops in Nigeria and in Malawi, and some ongoing partnerships there. To pretty great effect, I think. It was really interesting and had a lot of promise, and then COVID, right? But we hope to pick that up again. And also to just do a lot more kind of public scholarship and intervention as a historian, trying to speak to architects, trying to speak to engineers, trying to speak to urban planners, and talk about technological failure and the reasons behind, like, the persistent problems that they, like, want to pull their hair out about, and say, like, actually, so it might not be that people don't get it, or that you're so smart that it, like, that they don't understand you, but it might actually be a problem with the way that you're approaching this. And let's look historically at why that might be the case, and think about how we could do it differently. And there's been some take up on that, and I really appreciate it. There's a lot of receptivity among planners and architects. Certainly subgroups of those people, right? Not necessarily everybody, but there's been a lot of appreciation for that. And I think there's a lot of great movement happening in architecture and to some degree engineering, maybe a little less there, and in urban planning, people taking critical perspectives on these things and trying to take community needs seriously. So it's happening, and it's really great to have partners in doing that.
Yeah, that's cool. So, I mean, I feel like the book, the body chapters are kind of organized around these different sets of, like, areas of culture, themes, something like that. So I thought, like, could you just make the first two chapters are on sanitation and health. So we've already kind of, I feel like, kind of spelled out the picture of what you're interested in. And so, like, can you give the listeners a sense of, like, how these structures played out with something like sanitation and health?
Yeah. So the sanitation and health, the book is kind of, like, grouped. So the chapters are, like, the first two chapters are kind of the pillars or the foundations. Sanitation and health were the kind of foundational ideas or areas where these kind of policies and systems of regulation were established, right?
Yeah. It's just very common for that period overall, right? Like progressive era in the States, like,
in the U.S.
water
and Britain,
systems and public health efforts and all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the Victorian era of kind of engagement with, all the stuff that Albert, for example, was very Prince Albert was very fascinated with in London and elsewhere, right? Yeah, it's very common. And so yeah, this obsession with public health and sanitation, often not necessarily informed by science. So it's at this moment, right, in the late 19th and early 20th century, where there's a lot of scientific discoveries that are changing the way that people think about health and sanitation, particularly in the tropics, though in general. And so the mosquito vector, the discovery of the mosquito being the cause of malaria, the movement away from miasma as a theory of disease spread, and infection, like all that's transforming in this moment. And you get, bubonic plagues and other sorts of things happening again around the world. And it's interesting because so there's that new science that's coming in and these new professional categories of people like public health officers or medical officers of health who take on increased responsibility in the state and have decision-making responsibility and regulatory responsibilities. And you also have the persistence of some of the miasma theories in part because of racism, right? And a desire to justify segregation and to kind of pathologize Black bodies, right? And so there's a lot of contradiction and it's not often the language or the kind of history and narrative of this late 19th and early 20th century moment is the kind of rise of new science, right? And rationality. But in reality, there was still a lot of contradiction and a lot of racism informing what was happening. So miasma still kind of implicitly informs the way that people think about health because they're trying to justify continued residential segregation, racial segregation. Mosquitoes can fly farther than the length of the cordon sanitaire. Like it doesn't make sense. That you could just separate people and you would no longer have malaria, right? Like none of this makes sense, and they kind of know it, but keep doing it anyway. And it becomes a lever through which the colonial government can justify some of the actions and moves that it's taking to regulate the everyday life of people in terms of trying to decongest some of the city center and make it look more modern. And so that creates a whole set of policies. It's written into the some of the primary responsibilities of the Accra Town Council when it's formed. It is the primary thing that it is responsible for regulating and governing, and becomes the foundation for all the stuff that happens later with housing, with transportation, with trade.
Yeah, that's great. So I got a provocation for you.
Sure.
Ready? Okay, so. I think I heard it. I think I heard the twist when you were talking about the jitneys, the kind of bottom up innovations, we'll call them, and then state funding later. But sometimes when you talk about this stuff, you sound like Russ Roberts and other kind of libertarian economists who are they really think that state regulation of this sort that you're talking about is doomed to fail, and you need to think about emergence. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and that's how they would talk about this kind of bottom up stuff. Is that this is what humans do? They create solutions to meet their needs, and you're saying, they're actually better solutions most of the time because they're actually responses. But I think I hear you're saying is all right, but then we go to the next step further, and then it's there should be some kind of state support for this. Is that right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah,
right?
And people have limits to their expertise, right?
Sure.
So community members aren't always they don't always have the bigger picture, right? And we're not always good at seeing everything that we need or that our community needs when we're living in it, right?
Right.
So having external perspective and people to be able to ask critical questions, to provide you with technological skills that you might not have, to provide investment, which is really important because scaling up is key, right? Doing things at scale is one of the things that makes certain kinds of infrastructure possible, and the reason why we have states do it rather than individual communities.
Amen.
Right? Yeah. It's important, right? It's I mean, I'm ultimately quite supportive of the way Bernie Sanders used to say that taxes are the things that we agree to do together. Basically, taxes pay for the things we agree to do together, and that's what the state should do, right? I'm convinced of that, right? That makes sense, if nothing else, for practical purposes. I think my challenge to kind of government officials and technocratic folks is just understanding their limits as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So like we have to respect each other's limits and think about what we all can contribute meaningfully to the situation to provide meaningful problem solving instead of this assumption of a quite condescending assumption about who has expertise and who doesn't. And expertise only being defined in a really narrow way so that in Detroit, for example, you get urban planners walking into communities for participatory planning sessions and they say, here's the plan for your community.
Yeah, here's your problem, and I have the answer for it, right?
This is what we're going to do. What do you think?
Yeah.
And then everybody says, we hate everything that you say. We don't want any of that. Instead, we want this. And they say, yeah, we're not going to do that. Yeah. We're going to do this. Thanks for coming. Yeah. Right? That's a problem. And sometimes folks, communities have to be pushed a little bit to think beyond their immediate needs because it's hard to, especially, it's hard to see outside of your immediate context, right? And most of us are challenged by that, right? Yeah. There's the rare person who can like think strategically even when they're in the midst of stuff.
Yeah, well, especially if you're stressed and
absolutely
and short on resources and everything.
Absolutely, yeah. And so like communities that are precarious or impoverished, like certainly have can have real challenges in that, right? It's so hard to imagine a future when you're struggling to survive in the present. But I think it's all the more reason why we have to be extra careful about who's defining that future, who's having a say, and how much we're listening to what people actually value. So it doesn't have to be that they have all the answers, but if we create practices or if we create plans that are rooted in the values and cultures of people as they exist now, they're more likely to be successful, right? I talk in the book a bit and in lots of places about what I often call modernist conceits. And it's this idea that technology can change everything, right? So in urban planning and architecture, there's this assumption that if you change space or you change a building, it will change people's behavior.
Oh yeah, no, that's bullshit.
Yeah, no, it doesn't happen that way, right? Yeah. So like, you can move somebody from like, they think that you can move somebody from here to here. In reality, you can move people from here to here.
Right.
And it will always kind of push back.
Yeah.
And it'll seem like it failed. And in reality, you were just trying to push people to change too far, too fast. And it's a problem with USAID people and development folks who like sit in their offices in DC and imagine development policies for countries they've never been to, for people that they've never spoken to, for cultures they don't understand and histories they don't understand, right? Like, how is that ever going to be successful? Like, if you say it that way, it makes it seem absurd, right? That's even what happens, but it's very common in all of these fields, right? So it's just a call to like actually talk to people, and try to understand the people who are going to be impacted by the thing that you're trying to do.
So I wanted to ask, like, what's next for you? And usually when I ask that, I'm like, almost always it's like more maybe a different project, but more the same kind of thing. Not only do you have these kind of various practical projects you're working on, you're also an administrator and like doing that kind of work. So when I ask you this question, I'm much more like, I don't know, well, who knows? But like, so how are you thinking about kind of next steps around this work and where are you headed?
Yeah, I mean, I'm increasingly doing an awful lot of professional level service.
Yeah.
I'm on boards and things and trying to push some of our professional associations to think about these questions as well, and think about the politics of knowledge production within our discipline. And think about how it's related to teaching. And so there's that within a university like VT, I'm very interested, and you and I have been working on this or trying to think about it, right? Like, how can we take a polytechnic? How can we position a College of Liberal Arts and Sciences within a polytechnic to be not just a kind of redheaded stepchild or a Cinderella, but instead be the kind of driver of the work that's happening at this place, and to reimagine what interdisciplinary scholarship looks like. I'm very interested in, I became an academic, ironically, despite the fact that I talk about my research a lot these days. I really became an academic because I believe in the transformative power of education. I think it changed my life, and it was the reason I did this, because I thought it was a really powerful thing. I don't presume to think that my research has any kind of real transformative power aside from what I can practically do on the ground, which is why I do those practical projects. But I think the stuff that we do in the classroom and the stuff that we do in universities can really change people's lives.
Yeah.
And I'm very dedicated to expanding access to that. And I know I was very lucky to benefit from that in every part of my life. Yeah. And you shouldn't have to be lucky. Yeah. So that's a lot of the work that I do is trying to think about that, advocating for general education, trying to push new models of interdisciplinary scholarship and applied experiences for students. Yeah. All that stuff that I got to benefit from that so many people don't.
And I know another thing, I mean, we don't have to get too much details because who knows what will come out of the proposal we're going to write together. But I think the other thing is part of this, which is just very related to the whole conversation we've been having so far, is that, I think so often with universities in the States today, they're all trying to play the same game, which has to do with rankings and trying to be MIT. And if you look at their like morning news things, it's all like labs doing lab stuff, and it's the same story everywhere, But I think we both kind of, for all the problems of the history of land-grant institutions, I think we're both kind of committed to like the public mission of like dealing with local and not local problems, but like really focusing on that. And so, you and I have talked about this, so I kind of have a sense, but, there's always an experiment when you ask a question. So, how do you see potentially the role of, like, the humanities and social sciences in the kinds of projects you're talking about? Whether it's about transportation, or it might be about water issues, something and other folks here at Tech are interested in. Whatever the problem is, right? It could be housing, whatever it is. How do you kind of, what are some visions of like the roles of humanities and social sciences folks you have for them, the roles they might play in that?
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of Wendy Chun and the way that she talks about interdisciplinary scholarship and interdisciplinary collaboration, which is that everybody agrees on a shared question, and then we all come to the table willing to suspend the assumptions of our field, but also bring our expertise at the same time, which is hard. Yeah. And I think requires a lot of training that we all have to do. I had a lot of interesting conversations. I did a lot of work across all parts of the university when I was at Wayne State, in medicine and business and in engineering and social work and all kinds of places. And we were starting to see that success, right? We were starting to see the impact of that. And there was a real openness to from a lot of my collaborators where like the dean of the College of Engineering at the time said, I think maybe like the social scientists should tell us what the problem is, and then we should use our technical skills to help solve it. Yeah. And that's kind of it, right? Yeah. Like a little more complex than that, but I really do think that the humanists and social scientists are best positioned in many cases to identify what the problem is, at least on a kind of in a broader sense, right?
And fitting our earlier conversation, it's like surfacing what the community thinks the problem is, like working with affected communities and helping make clear what they think the problem is.
Exactly. And helping us think about like the cultures and values that underlie practices and so that we can do things that are more effective. Yeah. Because what we've seen over and over and over again, right, is that these models and theories are resulting in systems and infrastructures and investments that are failing and then waste massive amounts of money because they're not doing what people want, or they're causing enormous amounts of damage, right, or violence to communities. Yeah. And it's just not, it's not sustainable. I can't possibly fathom how a future that continues on that path is going to be a good one, right? And I think there's people out there who are doing really amazing things. And are at least they're trying, right? Yeah. I think the Fab Lab is something, the Fab Foundation and the Fab Lab is something I'm really interested in.
What's this?
So the Fab Foundation is an international organization of makerspaces, basically, that are trying to create a new model of production and development that is hyper local, but is also internationally connected. Right, so it's about sharing knowledge and sharing like plans and sharing ideas, but then producing locally. And so there's fab labs set up around the country that are trying to kind of experiment with this, right? And so like using maker spaces, really elaborate maker spaces to build, print, whatever, housing, to create experiments around like food production, to create incubator spaces for small businesses and other sorts of things. And I don't think it's the only solution, but I think it's at least being creative, right? Around thinking about what the problem is, and it's thinking outside the box. And I think that humanists and social scientists have the ability to help us think outside the box in ways that some of the other technocratic fields that are really...
They struggle with it, at least, right?
They struggle. I think for real reasons, right? Not because of like personal failings or to some degree it's a function of the nature of the way their disciplines work, right? But then some of it is about the fact that they emerged in the context of industrial capitalism to support industrial capitalism. Yeah. And that system, like industry, heavy industry, is no longer the dominant, form of production in the world today. And certainly not in the same way. And so, we don't have the resources to make some of the investments that people did, governments did in the 19th and first half of the 20th century. It's that stuff's just not possible anymore, right? But the way that a lot of those fields emerged was based on the assumptions that it would be, and that it still is. And that's why a lot of that stuff still fails. You also get the other challenge is that there's a lot of the leaders in the like sustainable development space, for example, come from countries with very unique conditions. So Sweden, for example, is who I work with a lot of Swedish academics and government officials a lot, and we frequently have conversations where I go, so you understand that the assumptions that are underlying your model for this, like it assumes a trust in the state that citizens have in the state that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Right. Like not even in the U.S. Like definitely not. Yeah. But it's hard for them to see that, right? Because they're living in it and they want to help, right? Because they have had quite a bit of success in advancing kind of sustainable development in their own country. But when you export those models, it becomes really tricky, right? And again, it's all well-intentioned, right? It's not like anybody's trying to be evil. Well, I mean, probably some people are, but like the vast majority of people, I don't think are trying to be evil or trying to engage in violence or trying to hurt people. But I think we just all live with assumptions because we are living in the moment we're living in. And that's one of the powerful things about history is that it can tell us that the moment that we're living in is a product of something and could be something different. Yeah. And the same thing's true for higher ed, right? And I think this new book, The New College Classroom, that was by Kathy Davidson and Chris, I'm going to forget her first name.
That's okay.
Technopolitics. They co-wrote this book that does a similar thing, right? It talks about the history of modern higher education in the United States, how it emerges out of and is designed to serve industrial capitalism in various ways, and how it doesn't really make sense anymore now that we're in a situation where that system is no longer operating in the way that it used to. And that we have to think in much more careful ways, like not this like knee-jerk neoliberal corporatization kind of way of like minimizing or maximizing profit, or minimizing costs and maximizing profit. But we really have to think a lot more creatively about the moment in which we live and how our institutions need to respond to that moment in order to best serve the people that we serve, and also to like, I don't know, have any shot in the future. And I really do. I mean, I tell people all the time, but I think, young Africans and people across the global South, but certainly on the African continent are often doing really amazing things, and I think are doing it outside of the status quo, but not ignoring institutions and structures either, right? They're not disconnecting. And I think if we're going to be saved, it's probably going to be by people like that. And, it behooves us all to listen.
Well, Jennifer, I feel very lucky to have you as a colleague here at Virginia
Likewise.
Tech. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today.
Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.